So here are the topics we want to discuss this time. And then the first, the play, and its kind of subsequent topics we are going to discuss from last year. And then how do we explore acting, the most important but least demonstrable aspects of theater in the past? So what materials can we use to do this? The second topic is past performance. How should we see current theater to understand the past? What kind of theater should be referenced? Then third topic will be audience. How should we study the audience? A very interesting but very elusive presence in Tahiti. And then final topic will be materials. So from what date does the UK have a wealth of pictorial and photographic materials? So it might not finish this time again, but we are hoping to take some time of break after the second topic. Then like 5 or 10 minutes break in the middle of the conversation. Then we start from the topic 3. Would it be okay for both of you?
よろしくお願いいた
Yes,
しま
thank
す。
you.
That sounds great.
Okay. So then shall we start from the topic number 1, play? And then if possible, and if both of you are happy with this, I might pop in the conversation if it's okay with both of you.
Of course.
もちろんです。
Thank you
よろし
very
くお願いし
much.
ます
Of course.
So let's start from the topic number 1.
はい。
So
やはりこの演劇ですので、
Yes, so we're talking about acting in theatre. This isn't literature. We are researching acting and performance in theatre. So from scripts, how does it take shape in a dimensional world is an extremely important question that we face. What is written down in words, how then
どのように
is
体化していくか、
voiced, vocalized, how it takes shape dimensionally, and what kind of acting is done on the basis of the script.
推定していく
How does that take place? How can we imagine that took place in the background, in the history? I think that's really important. But it's a very difficult thing for us to face and to understand. It requires a lot of process and procedures to figure out. So I wanted to ask Professor Stern, in terms of Shakespeare, when he existed, when he was alive, or in subsequent eras, what sort of methods are available to you for exploring this? Let us begin with that question, please.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. And I'm going to show some pictures in order to talk through the answer a bit. So if I just start sharing this PowerPoint. So I became very, very interested in the documentary traces from Shakespeare's time and in wondering what they might reveal to us about the way acting took place. And I know we've talked a little bit about this before, but I'll just show you some more examples and show you some of the things that they seem to tell us. And then you can tell me about the equivalent. So I suppose this is the earliest document for an actor that we have. And it's for the actor playing the role of Orlando in Robert Greene's play Orlando Furioso. And we've got a big long roll of it. It's now cut into separate sheets, but you can tell from the way that it's sewn that it was in a long document that was all scrolled together. So that it was a long document. And as you can see here, it gives the actor all his lines, everything he's going to say. But before each of his lines, it just gives 1, 2, or 3 words. So he has to listen out for those words and then say the speech, and then listen out for the next words and then say the speech. We call those words cue words. So for one thing, that revealed, well, if you've got a role then you can't flick backwards and forwards when you're learning your part. You must have to learn it in sequence. So that's interesting. That tells us something about how the actors would learn these parts. But the other thing that's very extraordinary here, of course, is that the actor is not given the full play. And that makes sense because writing out parts, you had to pay a scribe. It was expensive and paper was expensive, but there wasn't a thought that the actor would need the full text. So that also tells us something about acting, that acting was created out of your own words and what you said, but not out of anything said to or about you. And then we only have very few parts from early in time, this being the key one, because it's a professional theatre part. We then have quite a lot of parts from later time that look the same. So here in 1662, there are the actor's words. There again is the cue line with minimal words at the end of the cue line. And in all these instances as well, the actor is not being told who speaks the cue. So they're not being told who talks to them. They're just being told everything that they will say. So they've got to act in some strange way because they've got to create their performance out of their words, but with very little context, not even clarity about who they're speaking to. And here's a later part again. And the reason I find this example interesting, and we're now in the 1730s, but this part, in the middle towards the bottom, it says exit page 31, and then it says re-enter to Felix, page 32. And what that means is that the actor can cross-reference to a full play in which this is page 31 and page 32. And that means that a full play at this late stage is now printed. And if there's a full play printed, why isn't the actor just given the full play? And why is someone still paid to write out that part in manuscript? And it must mean that over time, actors came to love getting just their bits and didn't want the full play, that the full play was a distraction. And of course, when you think about it, maybe an actor wants a part that's just his bit, because then the actor is always the key character because he only has him. But there's also something very interesting about creating your character only out of your words. And so what I've found interesting in research terms is that although these documents are rare, they're mostly lost because they got used and then thrown away. But what one can do is take a full play and then break it down and create these parts and get them back. And it's been very interesting for me and very telling to take full Shakespeare plays and then break them down to see what an actor would be given. And then it's become clear that there's information that's very obvious to an actor from the actor's part, and yet is sort of hidden when you're reading the full literary play and you're following the narrative and the literary construction. You don't always see very clear information for an actor. Oh, this is one more. I won't concentrate on this. And so I will stop talking soon. I just wanted to finish this bit of story. But the players were given parts like this. And then we have various descriptions of how players then learnt them off by heart at home away from the other actors. So that also sort of put that whole business of learning performance into a domestic space away from a theatre space. And it showed you the actor owned his role, his scrolled up part, and he learnt it at home and it was his. So this is a quotation which says, "The player so beateth his part to himself at home, so he beats it into his head, that he gives it right gesture when he comes to the scaffold," which is to say, when he comes onto the stage, he'll do it well because he's beaten it into his head at home. And there's also a reference here to gesture. So as he's learning the words, he is deciding what gestures go with the words. And that also tells you that he's reading the part with an eye to gesture. And as far as we can see, an actor would read a part emotionally and would try to break it into the relevant emotions. So, okay, here I'm in love and I must do the love gesture. And then I'm jealous, so I must do the jealous gestures. And then I'm angry, so I must do the angry gestures. So there were some set gestures that he was practicing, putting together with his part, but in relative, not total ignorance of the play. He'd know the story, but without having the play to hand, having just his actor's part to hand. And Shakespeare variously refers to the whole business of learning, listening for cues, and then saying your part. So in Much Ado About Nothing, Beatrice has this line where she says, "Speak, count, 'tis your cue." And that's that's a joke. It's a theatrical joke because the actual cue for the actor will be the words, "'Tis your cue." And finally, and then I'm going to stop. I have some more examples to show you, but I've talked long enough. But just finally to show you this. This is an epitaph when the actor Richard Burbage died, and Richard Burbage was the actor for whom Shakespeare had written his most key roles, Hamlet and Lear and Othello. And when Richard Burbage died, there was this epitaph written for him. And the title is "On Richard Burbage, a Famous Actor." And then the epitaph itself is simply the words "Exit Burbage," but followed by a cue line, so that you can see it's his final cue, the last thing he must do as he goes off into oblivion. But that also shows that everyone knows what cued parts look like, because otherwise the joke, the actor joke of this epitaph wouldn't be clear. So that means, and I think that's because people who put on plays at school, people who put on plays at university, they were also given those cued parts, and they also learnt plays from parts. And that also tells us, so that tells us something about the way actors learned, but it also tells us, it's interesting for me because Shakespeare was an actor, but Shakespeare was a writer. So when he was writing, he will have been writing for his actors. And so he will have written the beautiful narrative arc, but he will also have written part-based information to tell his actors how to perform. So as I say, I'll show you some examples of that, but I'm going to stop now. Just to say, I know we've talked a little bit before about a Japanese version of actors' parts, and I wondered if you could tell me the relationship in Japan between the part text and the whole text, how the actor would rehearse his text, whether the actor thought about emotions, whether emotions had gestures, and all these various things that seem to be clear from English actors' parts. So sorry, that's many questions, but I'd be fascinated to hear what you have to say.
はい、ありがとうございます。非常に
Thank you very much. Very interesting documents that you shared with us on screen that I really appreciate. Thank you. And actually, the situation about scripts, I think, is very close to what we see in Japan. The most important thing is that in Japan, too, the actors never had this custom of receiving the entire script, the entire play. So there was some wood-based printing mechanisms which were available in the Edo period that did exist. However, very frequently the programs would change, the plays would change, so leveraging that kind of technology really didn't happen. So, for example, in the No theatre, the scripts that they use there, or in Joruri, which is the puppetry, the narrative script for that, people who were not professionals would train with them. They would have lessons, they would do practice rehearsals. Or, for example, they would learn it as music. They would sing those. So there was a culture, and within that cultural aspect, the performances that happened, there were printed versions of scripts which were available. So non-professionals would be able to get a hold of those documents and scripts. So that did happen. However, how that should be performed and played was not described. So, for example, it was there as the music was given out. That was the point of having the script, or it was handed out just for the point of knowing about the music or the content. But for Kabuki, truly it was an internal, almost like a secret that was protected within a troupe. So the Kabuki performance script being printed, and that would go out into the professional world of actors, that doesn't happen until the 19th century. That's the situation in Japan. Now, taking that into consideration, if, for example, you want to put on a Kabuki performance, so Kabuki began to pick up a lot of interest as a theatre form for the middle of the 17th century. In the 17th into about the beginning of the 18th century, it became established as a form of theatrical performance. So in the 18th century, a variety of different theatres began to have devices to allow more spectacular performances to be put on. But how that was rehearsed and how the actors would get a hold of the actual play, it's probably from about the end of the 17th century when we begin to know how that took place, and not earlier than that. And what we learn from that is that the performers didn't see the script. They weren't given the script. It was called written out extracts, kakinuki. So the lines that they would say would be written out for them, and that was what got into the hands of the actors themselves. So actually, what you just described for the UK, it's very similar to what happened in Japan historically. It seems remarkably close. So, which is the preceding dialogue? What's the line that goes before yours? Sometimes even that isn't included as information in what the actors had. So, at what point in time do we see the entire picture of a single script where it's all in one document? It's when they come together collectively as a troupe to do rehearsals. So, they would do these rehearsals. The writer, the author, would have, as the only person, would have the entire script. Then the author, it was called honyomi, or reading the book. So they would flip through the script. So he, the writer, the author, would read the whole thing through so that the actors would know what the whole thing was like. And then they would be looking at their lines, hearing the flow of the entire play, and say, oh, I see, so this line comes in this context, so this is somebody else's line that goes before mine, then I respond to it. So that's when they first understood at the rehearsal at where their lines fitted in, and then they'd go into actually repeated rehearsal. So that was the process that they followed. So the overall script never got to the hands of the actors. So basically, they are given roles that would suit them individually. They would actually have specialized roles. Like, for example, I'm the revenge guy, or I'm a colleague, or there's a particular roles or types that people had, and they would then adjust their lines to suit what the actual line was, how they would deliver it. So it's puzzle pieces coming together. They would individually, as specialisms in their own particular types of role, would come together to create the whole. So I believe that's the process that they went through. So listening to what you just described, what happens in the UK, or what happened in the UK, I think it's very similar. Almost a parallel can be drawn between the two. Now, in the world of Kabuki, the starring performer and the director, they were often the same person. This happens quite often. It's a sort of basic way that the troupe is formed for Kabuki. So the concept of a director that comes into Japan at around the 19th century. But up until then, before that, in Kabuki, there would be a top actor who was the lead position in the troupe, and they would have the role of directing. Even the word directing didn't really exist, but they would decide how would the play be performed. They would decide that they would give the direction for that. So they held the power and the authority to do that. But that person, if he wanted, could write out the whole script and could have that in his hands. Perhaps he had the power, other than the author, to have a whole copy of the script. So, for example, when you talk about existing script copies, so early 19th century, by the time you get to that point, at the back of a Kabuki script, there's a name that says this script belongs to. A lot of the extant scripts have that. So you can see sometimes that it's actually Narikomeya or whatever the actor's name was. You can see the actor's name on the back of the script book, and they still are extant now. So you can see that this is belonging to a particular actor through the name or the stamp in the back. So you can see the stamp. So you can see there's a series of script books which are still remaining that existed and were belongings of a particular actor. So by the time we get to the 19th century, these powerful actors with authority would be able to get a full copy of the script, of the entire script, and they would get a copy of that from the author. So it seems that at that point it was possible for them to do that. However, I don't believe that all actors got the big full copy of the script. So in that sense, it's not the case that all actors receiving the entire script. I mean, I'd like to hear about what the case was when that happened in the UK. When did that start to happen? Because in Japan, in the case of Kabuki, it's really late. I think from what I've researched, what I find is that for new plays, new scripts, or where you need very specialized rehearsing and practice time, it's really the 20th century. It's early to mid 20th century. Maybe everybody got a copy of the script. Sometimes you do see that. But actually, the classical programs, the classical plays, there's almost this supposition that you don't even need to get the script. You should know it. You know, even now, people do get the scripts, but there was expectation of knowledge. So probably around the 1950s, in the case of Kabuki, that everybody would start to get copies of the script. So I'd be very interested to hear in the UK, what was the timing for the entire troupe being given a copy of the script? So that would be my next question to you.
Well, thank you so much. This is incredibly interesting. And the parallels are just extraordinary. So I'm just going to talk through some of the parallels, and then I'll answer the question you've asked. So one is you were talking you were talking about having a reading of the play to the actors by the playwright. This was also the case in Shakespeare's time. The playwright would read the whole play to the actors, and that would happen before the parts were distributed. And after that, they'd learn their parts alone at home, and then they would come together for rehearsal. I think what's unclear to us is quite how much rehearsal they had, given that they were putting on a different play every day. For financial reasons, they couldn't have a long play run because everyone in a small London, everyone with spare money would have seen the play quite quickly. So it seems that most of the business of rehearsal was learning your part at home rather than what happened as a company. But there was at least one company rehearsal where they checked that everyone knew their lines and understood what was going on. But then in just the same way, a role would be handed on from one actor to another. So we sometimes do have actor markings on roles, showing that they owned roles and also who they gave roles to. And this is from slightly later in time. But I think what went weird, what went strange, was that we were starting to do something. We then lost our theatrical tradition, so we stopped doing it. But there was a stage where you would hand on the words and the gestures and everything else. And there are descriptions of Betterton, who was a very great actor in the late 17th century. And Betterton kept Hamlet and wouldn't give it over. So he ended up being a Hamlet in his 70s, having parents who were having a mother in her 30s. And he kept this role. And when he finally handed it on, he was so old, he had pains in his legs, gout, and he used to wince in performance. And they say that the actor who inherited the part would wince as Hamlet because that had become part of the role. And as I say, that sort of got broken down, but there was something interesting going on there. As with you, there wasn't precisely a director, but the person in charge was sometimes indeed, also in England, the chief actor, and sometimes someone called the prompter, whose job was to organize the practical mechanisms, entrances and exits, and to help actors who forgot their lines. But his job was not to have... So a modern director has a concept about a play, and a modern director is often slightly at war with the playwright. You know, the playwright wrote his play, and then the modern director goes, I see Shakespeare, your play, Love's Labour's Lost, but I am going to set it in France in an 18th century war. You know, so, and there certainly wasn't that. There was no one with a concept. The only concept was doing the play. So that's why we don't tend to use the word director, but there was the prompter or the key actor. But to go to the actual question you asked, which was when were whole scripts typically given out to actors? And the answer is once again exactly the same. It's around the 1950s. And that's a little bit to do with, yeah, it's very interesting. It's to do a bit with printing. You know, if you had a new play, it wasn't usually printed, so you were still writing out parts. And it was only when plays were typically printed and were quite cheap to distribute that actors would get scripts. So I also think maybe for older plays, an actor might have been more likely to get a whole script than for new ones. But it's a 1950s thing. And actually, talking to actors who do big musical dramas, you know, the big musicals like Cats or Les Miserables, those sort of musicals, they still basically get actors' parts because they need a part with the music on it, and they don't want the disturbance of everyone else's music. And that did actually remind me that I wanted to ask you a little bit more also about, you were talking about the music of the actors' parts, and I wondered whether the music, is it recorded in musical notation? And did the actors have the words and the musical notation, or how was the music conveyed to the actors?
Yes, in Kabuki, for example, the music that appears in Kabuki, many times that would be music accompanying the dancing. So the music that accompanying dances, there are separate dedicated parts, which means, for example, there's the dance script. And in that case, so there are the lyrics to the songs, and those lyrics are in the script. However, the music, Japanese traditional music, there's no notation. So the music part, they compose the music and then they complete it in a perfect way. Therefore, with rehearsal of the dancing, to match the music, how would they dance? The choreographers come together, and the choreographers were separate, and to match the music, this is the dance. And then the dancers would say, yes, I understand, and they would master it, and then they would dance. So that's how it was done. So there's no musical score that you would receive. However, probably the masters, like No and like the puppet play, the Joruri, the music alone being cut away and being rehearsed, there are audiences that want that. So the music was printed and it's also sold, put on sale. And probably the players were able to get hold of that quite easily. So there are lyrics, but the music, you had to memorize it. There was no other way to do it. So that's the Japanese traditional way that music has existed. But people said, well, actually, that's not doable. And towards the end of the 19th century, there was the unique way of capturing music, which is different from the Western way using 5 lines. So how does Japan capture music? There are a variety of people trying to be creative, and it's only among the professionals, though. And the laymen, all of the laymen sharing it among themselves, did not happen. So around Kabuki, related to Kabuki, that's how music used to be, I think. But in the 1950s, so that's quite surprising. And plus, that's very interesting. And like you say, once it became cheaper to print, that is a big precondition, I think. And one more thing. So people who need the whole script, the people who need it all, in the theatre, I think those people would start to appear outside the theatre. I'm not quite sure about this yet, but that's what I thought, because in the 1950s, towards the end, on TV, so they started to show the theatre on telly, which means the actors, if you had to say, if they had to, they would improvise. They will keep the play going. The play has to go on. However, on TV, you have to know the whole thing. Otherwise, you cannot put it on TV. So, right now, in a certain and sure way, we have scripts. There are 2 types, and one type is for television. This is the broadcasting scripts that exist in a separate way. So it's true, you do get the whole script for TV. And the other is for censorship. In Japan, before the war, in the 1940s, up until the 1940s, up until World War II, the government, if you want to put on a play, in particular, with the new Japanese modern theatre, the political thought, the government authorities were very wary of political thought being put on the stage. So they were wondering, what is the script like? What is the play going to be like? Regarding these works, the government forced the theatre to submit the script beforehand in modern society. And actually, once the war was over in 1945, since then, the GHQ, the US General Headquarters, said in Japanese traditional theatre, talking about revenge, for example, or harakiri, or killing yourself without respect for life. So the GHQ wanted democracy to take root, and the GHQ next were worried about what kind of plays would be put on. And they asked for English translations of the scripts. So that's what happened in occupied Japan, and that was mandatory. And I was in the US until last week because I was interested in the GHQ's censorship data, or the information to Berkeley. And it was mainly for movies, but regarding theatre too, they did have the materials. And for censorship, the scripts had to be submitted, and the scripts that were submitted, after being censored, they were given permission, the seal of approval, to put on stage. So we have those scripts that came back after being approved, but this was not printed, these were handwritten. Therefore, the play overall, the script for the whole play, the custom of preparing these, the full script, from the 1930s to 1940s, this took root. And then from the 1950s, like I said, next TV emerges. So because of this, from there, so if you're going to do that for the TV, then maybe we should provide the players as well, the actors as well. I don't know if that's the reason, but the script did start to be distributed among the players. And in Japan, there's the National Theatre. In 1966, the National Theatre opened, and at the National Theatre, Japan's traditional plays, right from the beginning, the printed scripts were sold to the audience, and that was also distributed to the actors.
So that was the habits that we had. So I think from there, all of the scripts started. The full script started being handed to actors as a normal thing.
Wow, that is completely fascinating. And there are some parallels, but I have to say, I hadn't known the story about the censorship, the Anglophone censorship of Japanese drama, and I'm quite horrified, really. I mean, particularly with subjects like revenge. I mean, all our great plays are, like Hamlet. Our greatest plays are about revenge. I mean, they tend to conclude that it's a bad idea, but that's outrageous. Well, we did have internal censorship in England for many years. The censorship tended to be about blasphemy, saying things against the Christian God. And at various points in time, the censorship was about subversion, things that might encourage the crowd to act against the government or something. So at particular historical political times, Queen Elizabeth I stamped out quite a lot of local drama because she didn't like that powerful local voice that wasn't determined by London. So we did have that, but that you had censorship so late and that it was done by a different country. I'm terribly shocked and sad to hear this, but interesting for you to see the texts. The one other thing I wanted to say, attendant on what you'd been talking about, is that actors who forget, who need to improvise when they're speaking Shakespeare, as sometimes happened to you. And as you say, you wouldn't want to do this on TV, but it happens even now quite a lot in the theatre. And in the theatre, it's sometimes called, instead of Shakespeare, Makespeare, because you're making up Shakespeare.
Yes, so when you're talking about acting and that improvisational aspect is a really tricky issue, actually, because there's no record of that performance. So when you're studying theatre and performance, it's really hard to get into this. But for me, when you look at the sort of medieval times in Japan, the Middle Ages, so for example, No is a highly classical, cultural, but it includes both song as well as dance. But it's based upon, there's a genre called kyogen, which is conversational, based upon discussions and conversations between just ordinary people. And again, this type of genre was one that they never really released or publicized the scripts. So for No, or for the Bunraku, the puppet theater, and Joruri kind of puppet theater, there are certain genres where the scripts were fixed, really nailed down, and then you would end up with these conversational types where they didn't have really nailed down scripts. So certain genres that did not lend themselves to that. So there was a preference not to have a nailed down fixed script. So actually, they valued improvisation, I think. That's the way I think about it or look at it. In other words, an amateur person can learn, go through rehearsals like a professional, and, for example, would want to sing a song beautifully or play a music beautifully. So you need to have fixed down, nailed scripts to be able to get that done. But separately, if you're a professional that's highly improvisational, so you had both of these genres happening in parallel. And those improvisational types of genres really didn't like to release scripts. So even now, tragedies, for example, they don't tend to release a lot of these scripts. And I think that's because it's that improvisational aspect. When you place weight and value on that, if you publicize the script, then you're tied to the script. And there's a desire not to do that. I think that's the nature of the actual play that describes that.
Yes. Again, I think that there are parallels, and the big thing is it's really clear that clowns and funny characters particularly improvised a lot, and the audience expected them to improvise and would kind of throw things at them and shout words at them to make them be funny. And almost all of that, the habit is recorded, but most of the exchanges are lost, apart from exchanges that were so routine that they became known. And one is we acquired our oranges from Seville in Spain. And so if someone threw an orange at you when you were on stage, you would say, this is a very uncivil orange, like a rude orange, but it's a joke about oranges coming from Seville. So we know that there were standard jokes to do with the bits of fruit that were thrown at you. But I think that's a clown thing. That's not a tragedy thing, you know, and clowns and improvisation, that there clearly was a kind of rich routine habit of that is mostly lost.
Exactly, I know. So when you talk about comedy and improvisation, if you don't record it now, we lose it, because you lose it as the time goes by. There is no record of it. So, for example, pre-COVID, when I traveled to London, I went to the Globe, I watched Falstaff, and it was a female that was performing Falstaff in that particular production. And it was pre-COVID. So the audiences, you know, standing audience, Falstaff would grab a beer off the audience and have a drink and give the pint back kind of thing. But, you know, so post-COVID, I'm sure that's a rather difficult thing to do in this day and age. And so I think that's a very uniquely pre-COVID thing that she did. But anyway, that in the modern day is a little different to what we've been talking about. But for example, if we go to maybe the 18th century, up until about then, talking about scripts, they're still there. We're starting to see that there are scripts that are there and being read, but how you then perform the script, how you put it into motion, into play. We talked about cues earlier, like this is the cue, and then the actor realizes, oh, this is my line. For the first time, they realize that. So within the mind of the actor themselves, they think about how to perform the role, and they're forced to create the role very uniquely, very isolated. I think that's very true. But as that accumulates, then the script alone might be the only thing that remains of a particular play. Well, then how was it performed? As a researcher, when I look at the script, I ask myself, how did they actually act this? How do they dig up the performance out of the text on the page? That becomes a really critical question for us. So what's your approach to that?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for this question. It is something I think we're both completely fascinated by that. And so I have a few thoughts, but so for instance, oh, hang on, let me try this again. Right, here we are. So for instance, sometimes you can create a text and you can look at the text and you can see that the text has really clear information to the actor that often you don't see when you're looking at the whole play. So I've made a text here for a very minor actor in Hamlet, Ronaldo. He's only in one scene. And if we just look at his lines here, you can see he says, I will, my lord, I did intend it, I very well, my lord, as gaming my lord, that would dishonor him, but my good lord. And you can see that he's just obsessively saying my lord. And when you look at the whole play, you don't notice this, but you see that the actor with the part would definitely notice, oh my word, I'm completely obsequious. I'm saying my lord all the time. I'd better say my lord in a funny way or a telling way, because that's mostly what I say. And I'd better single out the one line where I don't say my lord and say it in a really different way, because I'm speaking in a different habit for that line. So I think sometimes one can see rhetorical information that is performance information for the actor. It's not usually as clear as this. And another thing I got very interested in is sometimes you see a cue. Here's a cue of "have my bond." Here's what the actor would say, which is an insult. It is the most impenetrable cur is a dog, that ever kept with men. So basically, he'd hear "have my bond" and then say, "you're a dog." And when you look at the text, you see that cue being given out early. And then you're thinking, well, what? The actor doesn't know that this isn't the right time yet. So the actor will come in as soon as he hears the cue. And then when you read the text, you read that the text wants that to happen. So the text says, "I'll have my bond," which is the cue. It is the most impenetrable. And then it says, "I will not hear thee speak. I'll have my bond. It is the most impenetrable, and therefore speak no more." And you start to realize, oh, these plays are, they have certain codes in them for actors, which we can see when we think about the actor and the actor's part, and which we don't see when we're thinking about the whole text. So I came to be so interested in breaking plays down, because the more I broke plays down, the more I could see when gestures are required, when you're going to say words in a funny way, when you're going to interrupt one another, and the kind of dynamism and vivid nature of performance sort of was revealed to me a bit more when I broke plays up into what actors would be given. So, I've been a bit obsessed with doing that, but I do think there are some secrets hidden in plain sight that people tend not to see because they are watching and analyzing the whole play, but not thinking about the individual actor with his role. So.
なるほど。
I see. The players, they get only their own lines, which means that within only their own lines, how does the actor take them in? That's where he starts, and then he looks at the whole play. So in general, usually the whole play exists first, and then there are the lines. That's how you tend to think about it. But from the viewpoint of the actors, their lines exist first, and then as a result, the whole play exists. By looking at it from that perspective, you get a new perspective. I think that's what you're saying.
Yes, that is what I'm saying, and I'm surprised that it hasn't been sort of done more yet. But it's sort of been forgotten because the people who analyze plays tend to be literary people and not so much, theatre historians tend to talk about theatre history and literary people talk about literature, and the two haven't been put into proper dialogue together. So I do think there's way more to be discovered, but I think just, and I find it useful giving parts to students and saying, think about these, and they often notice things that they don't notice when they're reading a whole play. We're 1 hour in and we're still on topic 1. But it's
That's right. In that case, lastly, just one more thing regarding kabuki. So piling things up from the parts, and then from the parts, seeing the whole. That kind of research, I think, does not yet exist for kabuki. However, with kabuki, there's things that are unique to kabuki. There are certain unique lines or certain unique ways of saying things. Regarding parts like this, you say things like this. So there are set forms that already exist. And I think maybe that's what you're talking about. I think that's what you've been talking about. And earlier on, I talked about how in No or in Joruri, where the music decides a lot regarding scripts like that. That kind of research in a variety of ways has been moving forward, especially for No, with this kind of musical structure. There are parts that are created with certain musical structures, and they are limited. Therefore, with No scripts, there's the whole script that exists first. Oh no, it's not that the whole script exists and then the parts exist. What happens is each part is fixed first, and then like a mosaic, everything is combined together. So there's that way of analyzing theatre. And with No theatre, when you think about it, this is now textbook. And I think that, like you say, structurally, I think it's very similar to what you are saying and No theatre. So in that respect, from both sides, the way we do our research, or in doing our research, the way we try things out, trial and error, I think that we can learn from each other. I think there's a lot that we can learn by coming together.
Thank you so much. And it's really thought-provoking. And I just want to, I have some questions, but I will stop asking my question. But I just want to say a quick note. And now at my current institution, I am doing kind of theater workshop with my students. And we are reading Shakespeare, of course, in Japanese translation. But I will try to break the lines up and then distribute the lines of one particular character to students and how they will understand, how they will read the characterization of Shakespeare. Then, as Tiffany said, we might be able to find a new interpretation of the play itself as a whole. I will do that definitely. Thank you.
I think there are things that will be very clearly there, whatever language you read it in. You'll be able to see who asks questions all the time, who makes statements all the time, you know, who always uses angry words. And
Yes.
there are all kinds of things that are in the text that are part of how an actor should find the character, but also have a really interpretive effect. And it is particularly interesting because Shakespeare was an actor, and he was an actor at that time. So he was used to receiving parts.
Yes.
So the part will have been part of the way he thought as a writer, as well as the full text was the way he thought as a writer, thinking about both. And he knew the actors he was writing for as well. So I think he was also writing for particular skills and characters, and it was also the case that we were typecast a bit, as you were saying, that usually there's one person who looks dignified and is usually the king or the emperor, and probably has a crown he keeps at home and all of that. So, but yes, I mean, do you think we're probably going to need a third conversation, you know?
Thank you, and yes. Thank you so much.
In Japan, for example, with Kabuki or with No, of course, in the 17th century, in the 20th century, 21st century, we're not doing things they were done. So there's the 18th, 19th, 20th century. The theatre, as it was handed down, it has changed. Lots of things have changed. Of course, there is that characteristic. But even so, currently, the kabuki that is being put on stage back in the 18th century, 19th century, the scripts of kabuki back then, that's probably how they were reading it. This is probably the intonation that they were using back then. You can surmise, you can guess. That is possible at times. Regarding No, that's even more. Probably this is how they sung, or this is how they moved. This is probably how they did it. By learning today's No, you can learn how to read the scripts back then. And regarding European theatre, in principle, So it's slightly different from accumulating traditional theatre. It evolves in a different way. So to learn theatre in the past, experiencing theatre today, how can the theatre today and that experience be of use for research into the past, do you think?
Yes. I think that takes us into the second question.
Yes.
Really, yes, that is great. And so I have some thoughts, but I think, and I think this is a version of what you were saying, that there are various interpretations of the past that we have had in the present, and we have reconstructed theatres and we've done things to try to get back to the past. But sometimes I wonder whether our reconstructions are truly about the past or whether they're really about now. There's some sort of confusion. So yes, I wanted to let me show you a few pictures, some things I've been thinking about. So I've shown this before because we have barely any pictures of the actual theatre from the past. So everything we know about the inside of round theatres in the time of Shakespeare, everything we know, we've imagined from this picture. We have one picture, this one picture of the inside. We've got more pictures of the outside. This is the inside of the Swan Playhouse. And whenever we reconstruct a round theatre, we think of this picture. But this is not a very clear picture, and it's open to interpretation in various different ways. So anyway, here is this picture. And then here is the time, the Victorian era, when people got really interested in reconstructing theatres, and they hadn't been interested in that. The theatre had been moving forward, and then suddenly William Pole had this idea that kind of, let's get back the actual look of the old theatre, and then maybe we'll discover things about Shakespeare that we hadn't realized. So he was the first person to reconstruct the idea of a Shakespearean theatre. And this is one of those photographs of what he thought the Shakespearean theatre was like. But it's interesting in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways in which it's interesting is that our current reconstructions don't look particularly like this. So that this is William Pole's reconstruction of an Elizabethan theatre, but it's also really clearly an 1890s theatre because he's making it in the 1890s. So he was trying to get the past back. And I think our whole history of reconstructing theatres comes from him. But to what extent it's actually Victorian and to what extent it's really about Shakespeare is open to question. And the other thing that then so here's the picture we have of the outside of one of those round theatres, the outside of the globe. And again, we've had to construct the inside of the theatre and we've had to construct the outside of the theatre from these very vague pictures. This is a little tiny moment in a big map of London, a big picture of London. So in context, it's small and it's not the focus of the picture. So what happens is people started reconstructing theatres, and after William Pole, the craze for reconstructing theatres of the past sort of leapt to America. And I think that's because in America, they didn't really have any buildings from the past. So it was very easy for them to reconstruct and in England, where we have lots of old buildings, we didn't feel that urgency in quite the same way. So there are all sorts of pictures of brief globe theatres that lived in different bits of America. And here's just one, and you can see, how interesting it is, how it's gesturing towards being Tudor with the wood and things, but the wood is in very straight lines, it's very nice. Whereas in Shakespeare's time, the wood was kind of wonky because trees were wonky. They didn't have the instruments for making everything as beautiful as this. So again, it really looks a bit like a theatre of its period, but it's meant to be a globe theatre. And now here in Canada, here they are putting on a performance in a reconstructed theatre, but again, it looks different from the William Paul one. And I suppose one of the things I've been trying to get my head around is that we've reconstructed theatres in order to understand the past better, but all our reconstructed theatres are kind of made up. And depending on how you do your reconstruction, well, how you block your plays is determined by that. So I sometimes am worried that we're not making the discoveries we think we are, because all our reconstructed theatres have been statements about their own time. And here's the modern reconstructed globe. And it's maybe interesting to say that the reconstructed globe was financed, and the idea of it and the finance for it was American. So although it's in England, it's weirdly part of that American tradition of reconstructing theatres. And as I say, we didn't do it so much. And what I do think is strange is, because we have this reconstructed theatre, we forget to go to the actual places that are still standing where Shakespeare's plays were performed. You know, they were performed in royal houses, so they were Hampton Court. They were performed in the Inns of Court. They were performed in Oxford and Cambridge. And we keep not looking at the real spaces because we're looking at this artificial space, which in some ways is 1990s and in some ways is American. And also over time, it's come to be that this is sort of right, but it isn't right. Everything's wrong about it, actually. It was built on kind of compromise. And once again, it's the lines are too straight, it's too regular. You know, as far as we can see, the actual round theatres, the sides had a different length, and you'd build kind of roughly in a circle until you met yourself again. But this, you know, it's been drawn with a compass, a perfect circle and then sides of equal length. But that's not very early modern. That's not very Shakespearean. That's modern. That's modern architecture. And if you look at an actual building from Shakespeare's time in Stratford-on-Avon, we have a lot of them that they're all wonky, you know, they're not regular. And they're all determined by, this side is built from this bit of wood, but this side is a tiny bit shorter because it's built from a different tree that was less tall. And so you asked how we can learn from them, and there are things we learn about how to use the space, but I do often wonder whether we're learning about the past or learning about the present. And particularly now in theatre, theatre has become political in all sorts of ways. And for one thing, you can't really put on an all-male performance anymore, even though Shakespeare's performances were all male, because this is favouring one gender at the expense of another gender, and you can't do that. And you also, productions these days must represent diversity, and therefore mustn't be all white people. So for modern reasons, you can't be male and you can't be all white. But that's very distant then from Shakespeare's theatre, which was all male and all white. So we also have these reconstructed spaces, and then we sort of daren't use them quite in the way that they were historically used for reasons I totally understand. But I also, it's also problematic. So here's a production in the Globe, and you can see it's doing everything to eradicate the early modern features and be a modern production. It's almost sorry that it's in that theatre and wishes it were in a different theatre. And that's one of the things with directors as well, that directors don't want a space to tell them how to perform. So they just do their stuff with the space. And then you wonder, why did we reconstruct a theatre for this to happen? But, you know, so very modern things happening in these reconstructed spaces. And as I say, that's a little bit because people don't really like reconstruction anymore. They find it really problematic. And just quickly, I'll take you through reconstructed, those are all round reconstructed outdoor spaces. For indoor spaces, again, we've got one picture on which everything is based. And here is the picture of an indoor space with the chandelier, with the two chandeliers. And that led to this very pleasant reconstruction in Virginia. And but once again, you do mixed race, mixed gender, diverse productions in it. And then it also led to, here's this beautiful reconstructed theatre, the Sam Wanamaker Theatre in London. And I was involved with the reconstruction of this theatre. And because I was involved in it, I sort of know how kind of wrong it is, because it got the idea of like this the beautiful painted back of the theatre is slightly based on funeral monuments, and that's why it's black. And actually, black is a very poor color to act in front of. You know, and I don't think I think the wrong thing was researched. You know, it's borrowed all kinds of research from different places and pooled it all together. And each bit of research is beautiful, but together they don't really make sense. So yes, so which is to say, I think you were asking what we can learn, and I was sort of saying stuff. I was saying a bit about the things we can't learn or we learn wrong, which is a sort of sad way to answer your question. But we're at a very intriguing historical time.
Yes, but how should I put this? Regarding the way we make the mistakes and our honest efforts to learn the past, the direction that we are taking, actually in Japan, I'm sure there are very similar situations in Japan too. So you were saying 1893, back in Japan, that would be when the modern government was set up, maybe 20-something years since that came into being. And in Japan at that time, what was happening in Japan from around here, from the 1890s until the 1900s, 17th century Japan, they wanted to learn from then. So that's back from the Genroku era. Japan wanted to learn from that era. There was a big boom. And back in the Genroku era, the Japanese kimono costumes, they wanted to bring those back. But this was not a complete thing. This was not a complete copy. So what they wanted to do was, realistically, these were campaigns in the department stores. That was how it started. And in that way, it started. So the Genroku-type designs became very popular. And actually, apart from that, the Genroku era, or around the Genroku era, the way the theaters were. Regarding the current modernizing theater, can we not watch Genroku plays in the modern theater? So there were new plays written for this purpose. So this is back when there was no main road down the Kabuki theater. So on stage, they created these Hanamichi main roads. And it's slightly different from Kabuki today. Kabuki from a slightly older era would be put on. So plays for this were written back then. And what you just showed me, the old reconstructed theaters, and I think it's very close to what you just showed us. And it's slightly different from the real thing. It's slightly off. And I think, again, I felt lots of similarities. In the 19th century, around the end of the 19th century, they were saying, let's learn from the past. We were about to enter into the 20th century. So the past, you were maybe overdoing it in trying to learn from the past. And it turns out that that exists both in Britain and in Japan. And I find that very interesting indeed. And in the US, there are lots of Shakespearean theatres. So at our theatre, it was born in 1928, we copied the fortune in building our theatre. And the Globe and the theatre and our theatre, maybe we can do something together. And we're saying, maybe we should we should get all the replicant Shakespearean theatres together, get them to come together and have an event. So actually back then I learned that there are lots of Shakespeare theatres in the US. That's when I learned that. And Tsuboichi Shoyo, he learned not from the globe but from the fortune, because the fortune, so there are still contracts of selling and buying the land. So maybe we can build something with a certain level of accuracy. And there was lots of research about the fortune back then in Japan, in the 1920s. So we did want to build the globe, but we didn't want this to be a false globe. That's why we decided on the fortune. So that's what Tsuboichi Shoyo decided. And I think he was he was holding himself down in doing that. And then after that, regarding the current globe, yes, I agree with what you said. So what's being done on the globe right now, so that's going to be contemporary Shakespeare. And it just so happens that in 1999, I went there for the first time, and there was an all-male version. They were putting on Julius Caesar, and it was all-male cast. I was able to watch that. But Sam Wanamaker, of course, he's American, and he's a movie director, and he's also a TV director. And Columbo, he was also the director of Columbo, I think. So Sam Wanamaker. So McCarthy, because of the Red Purge, he moved away from Hollywood, he came to London, and now that he's in London, maybe he should go to the Globe, and he went to look at the Globe and there was nothing there. There was nothing there. Is it okay to have nothing there? That's how Sam Wanamaker started his lifelong campaigning. So it all started out in a very strange way, but like you say, so the US way of thinking, that's what started this. And in Stratford, and I too, regarding, it's not like I went to see medieval Britain. I did went to see the Cotswolds, of course, but there are lots of buildings all over the world that have nothing to do with the real thing. And geometrically, there are very beautiful, straight globe theatres. And it's true that the true thing was probably not that straight. But in Japan too, actually, with modern-day technology, with modern-day sensitivities, with the way we think now, trying to reconstruct something like theatres from the Edo period, it's not like that doesn't exist. So I'd like to share this with you. And this actually is in Japan. This is the Heisei Nakamura Theatre. And Nakamura Kanzaburo is the person who led the way in building this theatre. And this is very, very similar to Edo Theatre. They tried to be as close as possible, and the top part, as you can see, it's a tent. But actually, this is like a temporary stage, and you take it apart, and then you take it somewhere else. So it's a mobile kind of Edo-type theatre. That's how it was built. So in that respect, it's not aiming for a complete reconstruction, but the atmosphere, I think, you can enjoy an atmosphere that's very similar. And you can actually take it to New York, you can take it to Germany. And it was actually taken to New York, and it was actually taken to Germany. And it hasn't been to Britain or France for some reason. So if you had to say, as a fake, an Edo theatre that was built as a fake, but it uses current, modernized Japanese grand opera, and is slightly different from current kabuki. So this is not the Edo theatre as it was back then, but it's Edo-like. So that kind of thing, like you say, there are a variety of research, a variety of wisdom that was brought together, but it's not an accurate reconstruction. So that kind of reconstruction. So it's true, we all try to do that. We go through trial and error. And in that respect, it's very similar, what you are doing and what we are doing. And of course, we put on Edo plays here, but they're not exactly the same as the Edo plays back in the Edo period. It looks Edo-ish. So it's only Edo-ish. It's not the real thing. So in that respect, too, we're both doing something very similar. And once again, I was able to feel this.
Thank you. Thank you. It's fascinating to see that picture. And I wonder if you can tell me about how the audience interact with the drama in a reconstructed theatre. Because one thing that happened in the Globe was that the audience were told that they could shout out to the actors, and they were very excited. And there's now a particular way of being a Globe audience, which is different from an audience in another theatre, which is quiet and sits in the dark and watches the stage. And the audience interact, and the audience and the actors love that. But I no longer know whether they're doing something near to the past or whether they've just invented a way of using that space. Because these days, the actors will go on stage encouraging the audience to interact. And sometimes you think it's not at a place where the audience should be interacting. And sometimes you know that the audience have gone in order to interact. And again, so I think there's now a Globe way of being an audience, but I'm not sure how true it is. So I wondered about the audiences in your reconstructed theatres.
なるほど。多分同じようなもので
I think that there's probably something quite similar going on in Japan too. So this shows the audience. It's another picture of the theater I was showing you a moment ago. But kabuki audiences have always been vocal. They're fine to raise their voices and shout. And while the performance is happening, they can have a bento box, they can eat, they can drink. There's never been those restrictions. Those were always the conditions that the kabuki audiences were placed under. But actually, this Nakamura-za theater, the very front rows, they have deliberately no chairs in the front row, no seats. Because in Japan, as you live in your day-to-day lives, Japanese people, we're very modernized now. So living on tatami, living on the floor, is actually really difficult. So people like to sit on chairs. People are less comfortable sitting on the floor now. Japanese people physically are like that. We're very much more westernized in that way. But in fact, they deliberately, for the front rows, they chose to say no chairs, no seats. You sit on a zabuton, which is a cushion, a flat cushion that you sit on the floor on. By doing that, from where you're sitting, you're already in a place that's outside of your day-to-day lives. You're forced to experience something that you don't do so often. So we're creating something similar to what used to be. So already, by the time you're there to view something, to see something, you're actually already in the play. By sitting down, you're already taking part. So they have made some successes, I think, in doing that. And the chairs, for example, this being a tented structure, as you can see, these aren't proper permanent chairs. It's just benches with some partitions and a few cushions on there. So actually, they're very simple, these chairs that they're sitting on in the house. So normally there's this respect for the individual, theatre chairs with their armrests and so on. It's not like that. You are sharing a space with the type of seating that's provided. You see my background. So this is the current Kabuki-za theatre that we have. The current one, as you can see, individualized seats. You get your own seat. But that's not the case for this picture that I'm showing right now. And they deliberately chose to do that. So in that sense, there's a different ambiance that they tried to create. I think that's what they attempted to do. And you can eat your bento lunchbox, you can shout, you can be vocal, you can drink, nobody minds. And Nakamura Kanzaburo, in terms of showing closeness and appreciation for the audience, he would deliberately walk through the house, for example, or he would kind of push past members of the audience. Or he'd do sort of, if he was he might steal a handbag out of the audience if he was playing kind of trickster type of role. So he would do that deliberately. He created those opportunities to interact with the audience. So Nakamura Kanzaburo, he took this theatre, this mobile theatre, to New York. And when he did, he took a lot of English lessons so that he could say some of his lines in English. And he would perform some parts in the English language. And he would have this interaction or exchange with the audiences in New York as well. That's something that he did. So I think that's something you don't see normally in the Kabuki-za theatre normally, that relationship. They deliberately created that here in this venue. And I don't have a photograph, but there are certain seats. They created seats that are kind of inside of the stage, so hidden behind the drapery or the curtain, so you can only see from the side. So the cheaper seats, the ticket price is lower, but actually back in Edo period, they used to have these seats, I understand. So they even used to have audience seats at the back of the stage, for example. Sometimes they would have audience above the stage. We have lots of records showing all these different places where audiences could sit. And these were experiments that they were trying to do and trying to replicate here in this theatre. So, in a sense, now, that playfulness, if you like, or that kind of irregular approach, if you did that now, the audience today might react quite positively. We have a quite mature audience. They wouldn't get angry by putting in these odd seats, these odd places. And, it's precisely because we have this modern, sophisticated audience that you can try out and experiment things that were not modern, but from a long time ago. So they experimented with many things in this particular venue.
That does have, again, just extraordinary parallels, I think, with the Globe, because that you were talking about the area of tatami mats where they're sitting, and this is now sort of an unusual way to be approaching a play. And I guess the parallel is with the Globe, where in that same space they're standing, and again, this is not usual anymore. And so that unusual way of being, it makes the audience, maybe as with sitting, when people are now used to Western chairs, it makes the standing audience get restless because they want to move their feet around, and I think that makes them ready to interact because their legs are a bit tired. And I think maybe there's something similar going on with this theatre. So yes, I keep being excited and struck by the extraordinary parallels. I think last time you suggested that maybe the parallels simply are, but I still wonder now to what extent we might have been learning information from one another, or whether it's just that certain things happen in certain periods of time.
Exactly. I feel the same way. I feel like when you look at all these similarities, these parallels, what that seems to suggest is that as we open up our knowledge and gain knowledge, perhaps there is a really big piece of way of how modern society looks back on the past. I mean, this could be a really big theme for research that would open up. I feel like there are a lot of examples that we're kind of digging up right now and exploring.
So shall we start the topic 3 about the audience?
Let's do that. So regarding research into the audience, so this is something where there is demand, but this is actually very difficult. So there's no accurate data or materials, which means in what way were the audience accepting or taking the theatre? That's very difficult at times. Whatever the era, it's very difficult to know. And in the days of Shakespeare or the days after that, research of the audience regarding this in Britain and in British theatre, what ways are you doing this, researching the audience?
Oh, thank you for this question. As you say, it's not easy, and one of the problems is that the information you have about audiences often comes from when audiences behave badly, because that leads to an anecdote or a story, and that's what gets preserved. So I've had some difficulty knowing whether audiences were always behaving badly, or whether it's unusual for them to behave badly, and that's why these things get recorded. So I'm not going to I'll read this. So there was one habit of saying that women who come to the audience, women in the audience are, it says at the top, are so set forth, so trimmed, so adorned, so decked. So they're wearing clothes that make the place a market of wantonness. So they're wearing clothes that are very sexually suggestive. And the second example says that they go to the playhouse with their breasts out, which was sort of allowable, but it was a way of showing that it was supposed to be a way of showing that you were a virgin, but it was also obviously a very sexual way of dressing. And the third example is again of a sexually available woman. So one thing they were forever saying was that women went to the playhouse dressed in a provocative way to attract men. But the extent to which this is really the case is not so clear. But it is the case that you shouldn't, as a woman, go to the theatre on your own. If you're a good woman, you should have a man accompanying you and protecting you. So we can see we can gather some gendered things about the crowd, even if we don't know quite how precisely to read this. This example up here, this is a tradesman's wife who went home and said to her husband that she'd lost their money, she'd lost her purse. And then her husband says, "Where did you put the purse?" And she says, "It was in my underclothes, in my petticoat." And then the husband says, "Oh, didn't you feel there was a hand there to take the purse? Didn't you feel that was happening?" And she says, "Yes, I did feel a hand there, but I didn't think he'd come for that." So these are all stories about kind of naughty sexual antics. So the women are dressed sexually, there's sexual stuff happening in the audience. And that clearly is somewhat the case. But it's also the case that a lot of people who tell these stories are saying, that's why you shouldn't go to the theatre, or that's why theatre is immoral. So we are learning some things about audiences, but which, as I say, are very often sort of anti-women things. And then we also learn a certain amount about the things they're throwing at the actors. Here's a reference to throwing tiles and pears against our curtains to allure us forth. So this is throwing roof tiles, which means they're tearing them off the theatre, pears, the fruit, and throwing things until the actors come out and entertain the audience. And here's a joke, I won't read it, but it's a joke about an apple that hit an actor on the face. So there are lots of things like this, but as I say, because they're anecdotes and they're either funny or condemning, that makes it hard to know whether these are the normal stories or the abnormal stories. And one other thing I found very interesting, and I wonder if you know of an example of this. And this is the actor William Kemp, and he was a clown actor, and he was a clown actor in Shakespeare's company. And he tells this story about a cut purse, and a cut purse is a thief who, your purse used to be hanging on your belt and the thief would cut it off. So a cut purse, and then he describes a cut purse as such a one as we tie to a post on our stage for all people to wonder at when at a play they are taken pilfering, which is to say that, oh, that's the terrible kind of cut purse who's the type that we shame by tying to one of the stage structures, one of the posts on the stage, if we see them doing bad things at the audience. And that now means you're acting on stage, but you've got a thief tied to a bit of it. And presumably the thief is then going to shout out or do, you know, or do things. So I think that's the oddest bit. That bit where the worst member of the audience suddenly is thrust into the middle of the production. but otherwise, as I say, we've got information about naughty women, sexually available women, and we've also got information about throwing things on stage. And then I'll show you some pictures, but those are from later in time. So I just wondered whether any of that rang a bell or was equivalent for you.
そうですね。一般の
So in terms of general or regular audience, we just don't have a lot of documents. So I think I feel very similarly to you about that lack. But in the case of Japan, for example, when you talk about the fans in the audience, research about fans in the audience or about fan groups, documents about that, texts and materials are still available to us now. So for that incredibly passionate fan, there are some things that we know about what those passionate fans were like. But for those maniacal fans, if you like, how much they were the norm or how far they were at one end of the spectrum and how special is really hard to determine. So that's something that we do face. Now, what I'm about to show you, this is up on Box, and it's one of the many documents that you've seen before that you should see in the Box document. So at the bottom right, you have a bowing actor, and then to the next of it, there's somebody with a hat on, and they've got pieces of wood in their hand, and this is actually somebody who is clapping pieces of wood together, and that's a member of the audience. On the head, they've got like a rag, and they've got this, it's almost like a uniform that they wore, a towel on the top of their heads, and they all wore the same uniform, if you like, the same clothes. And for the first time, this is an actor who's come from Osaka, and this is about introducing the actor to members of the audience. So the Osaka companies would do that. So this fan group were the ones who are having this introduction. It's almost like a ritual that the actors would go through, and that's what's depicted in this picture. But, you know, to be able to create matching uniforms, they had a lot of economic power in terms of that particular audience demographic. I would certainly imagine that to be the case. So let's think about just your ordinary average audience member. I'm not sure that they would do this. So you're talking about people who are relatively blessed economically, and they're able to spend that money in Kabuki, watching Kabuki. So those fan groups are known for the various activities that they did. So, for example, at the left-hand side, in the middle, it's almost like a cupboard or a cabinet. This is from the Edo period in the 19th century, mid-19th century. It's scrapbooks which were put together. This is about a single actor, documents, texts, materials, gathering together everything that could be found, pictures and so on, cut them out, paste them, glue them into these scrapbooks. So in this way, there were fans who were so passionate enough that they wanted to make this. Or, for example, inside the pictures, you'll see a whole variety of different pictures and images that we have available to us. Let me try and find it to share. 1 second while I get it set up. So, for example, what I'm showing now, this is similar to the fan group member that I showed you earlier. They're dressed quite similar, as you can see. And you can see the face is very accurately depicted or very closely depicted. So it's supposed to be a close or real expression of the face of the person. But this is not an actor. This is a regular audience member. So this person probably paid money and had his portrait drawn, and then here as an ukiyo-e-style block print. I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't have sold this, but I bet they had quite a lot of these printed up, and he would have distributed them to friends and his acquaintances. I imagine that's the kind of person this was when I look at this. So in this kind of way, you had fans. And when you think about these fans, in Japanese kabuki, there is this scheme of grading the kabuki actors. So they would look at the activities of that particular actor, and a few people would gather together and they would debate, how was that actor? How well did that actor do? Oh, they did that role well, but that role, they weren't very good at. So they would do a joint evaluation of the performance of the actors. Now, they would do this and they would debate this, and then they would be published every year in a book. But this is like a virtual round table. It's not the case that it's a record of real people who got together. It isn't minutes of a meeting. It's probably, if it was this kind of fan, they probably would have said this. It was hypothesized evaluations and reviews. So that's what then got put into a book. So they would accumulate this information into a publication. So this would be looking at the prior year, what the actor had done. It's basically ranking the actors year on year. So it's a ranking of the Edo actors, a ranking of the Kyoto actors, a ranking of the Osaka actors. And then they would have 3 books with the 3 cities, and they'd put it all together, make it into a single publication. So this was a custom that they had for more than 100 years in the Edo period. It continued on for such a long time. So this virtual roundtable review or criticism. So these people who were thought to have been the speakers that would have shouted up, we had like the elderly person in the room or somebody who's incredibly knowledgeable about plays. But actually, there might be this passionate fan of such and such an actor who was deemed to be in the room, or somebody who just likes any old actor as long as they look good. So they imagine these different profiles of fans that they would put into this roundtable review. Not real fans, but people who were like, this is probably somebody who exists out there in the world, and they would have this virtual person. And in the Edo period, they had this imagined audience member. They would feel who the audience would be. So it's really interesting from that perspective. But then, well, how real is this? How much did this reflect reality? If it had no connection at all to reality, it would never have worked in a publication. So it's very difficult about how we treat this particular document, this material. But this publication continued for more than 100 years, which suggests that it's, well, first of all, I think it's very rare anywhere around the world to have something like this. So we do have examples like this, but again, I come back to the regular audience. How frequently did they get to a theatre? It's really hard to figure that out. So maybe it was once a year, a super special occasion that they would go to the theatre. How frequently did they visit the theatre? You know, you hear some stories about, for example, like the daughter of a very rich family. But again, the theatre goer, if that's the term, you know, how frequently do you have to go to be a goer? It's really hard to understand that.
Gosh, I'm amazed by those extraordinary documents. And here we're at a moment where there are no parallels. I don't know of anything like that. And I'm also fascinated by the fans who wear the same costumes. Again, we don't know of anything of that kind happening. And I loved the picture of the fan who he seemed to have camels on his clothing. I don't know what was going on with his dress, but so that is wonderful. And I think we're now at a moment where up until now we've been talking about parallels, and now we're talking about kind of absence of parallels. We would love to have such documents. What we do have are later reviews, but they're not the reviews start, they're kind of 18th century. We don't have reviews before then. We have pictures, and these are mostly also 18th century. But again, as with the anecdotes, the pictures are usually because of bad behavior in the audience, not normal behavior, or because the pictures are not, the pictures are often kind of poking fun at the audience. So here's an audience picture, but it's sort of ugly audience members laughing at the play and the poor musicians playing in the front. The audience members are, but this is satirical about the audience members, and its point is that a lot of them are more interested in the people selling the fruit and other sexual things, that the real drama is in the audience, not on the stage, I think is the point in a picture like this. Or here's a picture showing people who are weeping at a sad play. You know, these are interesting, but they're much later. And as I say, they're usually a little bit at the audience's expense, sort of laughing at the audience. Or here are comedy spectators laughing and tragedy spectators crying. But these are nearly always done by cartoonists or people with who are making a slightly satirical point or who are laughing at the audience. And again, they're also 18th century pictures. Here's audience, and this is all about how the audience are creating as much drama between and amongst themselves as is happening on the stage. So you can see the vomiting one in the middle. He's had too much to drink and he's vomiting on an audience member below. But these are grotesque pictures, you know, and you can see on the far left at the bottom, there is a man and a woman in an embrace, and they're not interested in what's happening on stage. Here's a further picture of the same audience. You can see in the center, there's a dog who is attending the play, and you can see at the bottom, people are having a fight, you know. So these are great at kind of, and on the left, there's someone who's letting down a jug of water so he can pour it onto someone else's head. So we've got pictures of bad behavior in the audience and the audience having more drama than is on stage. And so we've got all these characterful pictures, but they can't really be remotely real, because if these were the case, no one would be watching the play. So we do have these pictures, but it's a bit like, as with your kind of, here is information, but what information is this? Particularly, as I say, because our anecdotes and our pictures are mostly satirical, jokey, anecdotal. We don't have nearly the amount of serious information that we would really want.
Yes, the audience, or the world of the theatre itself, it's been curricularized, and that's the same in Japan. So there are books that introduce the world of kabuki, but if you had to say, they tend to show it in a very funny kind of way. Or they say they'll introduce the world of kabuki, but they say, let me take you to the world of kabuki or the country of kabuki, like a guidebook. And they say, but this country, it rains, people bring out their umbrellas, but they never get wet. Why don't they get wet? So they seriously talk about this or write about this, and in a variety of ways they explain what the play is like. So the more you know about the play, you can say, oh, this person is trying to be funny, and you can enjoy it. But regarding the audience too, for example, there are books like this, and maybe it's exactly the same perspective. It says exactly the same kind of thing as what you just showed us. This is a book from the early 19th century. And this shows you the audience watching the stage. And this is not very high-class seats. And they're being rather rowdy and noisy. And you can see them in a picture like this. And I think this is very similar, or pretty much the same perspective as what you just showed us. And here, it's not like they're behaving that badly, but showing the audience overall, there are lots of pictures like this, and among them, so they're not watching the stage, they're eating, or they're eating from a pot. Sometimes there are pictures that depict audiences like that. So that way of thinking, I think, is very similar to what you showed us. And this shows the audience. And this book, other than that, in a variety of ways, it categorizes the audience. So what kind of audiences are there? Once again, it questions that. And this is half caricaturized, and among this, there are lots of, how should I put this, there are some difficult audiences, it's rather satirical, and the most troublesome customers, so they know a lot about tradition, and they will teach you about tradition. And they will say, look at this from this wonderful actor in the past. And they will show you the symbol marks of the old actors. And when you think about this as something that belonged to the old traditional famous actors, it makes you feel really grateful, or we should be more thankful, things like that. So let me show you. So this is a member of the audience who loves the old things. He's a fan of old things. And he says, take a look at this. So these are all symbols of old actors. So it looked with the old actors, because they were such wonderful actors, even their symbols look wonderful. And compared to that, the actors today are horrible. So there are members of the audience like this. And that's the kind of thing they do when they categorize the audience. So probably categorizing the audience is being done not only in Japan. How should I put this? So this is like analysis of culture, analysis of customs, and I think you're probably doing that in Britain as well.
Yes. Yes, I think what we have in Britain, which itself was categorizing the audience, was that different bits of the theatre cost different amounts of money to go into. And so the audience would end up being divided by class in some ways, because there'd be the audience in the cheap seats and the audience in the expensive seats. And they're always described as acting in a way consonant with their class. So I think that is a bit the case. Here's a description of, let me find it. Let me share this. The upper region of the stage, so the upper region of the theatre, so that the very top bit, which was the cheap bit, where there are noisy people, sailors, footmen, low tradesmen. They drink, they whistle, they howl. They throw things on actors and spectators in the shape of nutshells, apple cores, orange peel. And so this is but again, it's a later description, but it's a class-based description of the kind of high up people in the cheapest seats and their poor behavior. What we don't have is so much clear description of the fans that you do. And yet we do have information about fans, but what we really know is that they would join, and again, this is later in time, they would join clubs and they would reenact the bits they really liked and try to say them the way the actors did. And these were called spouter clubs, because they would spout, they'd speak in the actor fashion. So they'd get together and reenact their favorite bits, and that was how they expressed their fandom. But I don't know that they had anything. I mean, the picture of the man with the symbols, that looks a bit like people now who collect autographs or something from a favorite actor. You know, you have a material trace which isn't part of the performance at all, but sort of gives you some of that precious actor. So I am very fascinated in that. As I say, I think our records get us nearer to the bad behavior than the good behavior. And it sounds as though maybe your records get you nearer to the good behavior than the bad behavior.
Of course, there are records, some records about bad behavior as well. But regarding class differences, In Japan, that exists in the audience as well. So customers or audiences in the expensive seats, audiences in the cheap seats, and like I said, there's the evaluation of the actors in the imaginary evaluation. There are the opinions of the audiences in the expensive seats, and then there are the opinions of the audience in the cheaper seats. So that's probably based on the values back then. So if you had to say, there are some who are very hasty to say what they want. That kind of structure can be seen in those kinds of round tables. So the difference in the class or the difference in the prices on stage, what do they like? It's reflected in what they like. And that perspective probably is being shared in Japan as well. And also, it's not only the fans. In Japan, for example, for the audience, there are things like books that extract the wonderful lines, the wonderful actors' lines, and they've been published. And looking at this, there were lines like this, or there were lines like that, and they try to memorize the lines, or they try to speak in the same way as the actors. So they try to copy his habits, or there's that kind of culture. And this actor, he will emphasize this part. If you emphasize the lines in this way, then you're very similar to that actor. There are guidebooks that were published that teach you how to speak like the actor that you like. So for fans, there were a variety of publications and in detail. So I don't know if they are really helpful or if they're not helpful, if they're overly helpful, but they do exist.
Okay, thank you very much for the fascinating dialogue. And because the time, unfortunately, the time is running out, and so so how about
Yes, I know. So I think audiences, how they change over time with chronology, or how plays will change with time, but how audiences truly were taking that on board, that detail, I think in terms of, you gather as much as you can about materials about audiences, but there's so much that you don't quite know. You can't possibly know everything. There's always this portion that you cannot know, that you cannot learn. So again, that's something that as researchers of theatre, I think in Japan as well as in Britain, there will be common points that we can meet on. I think that when you look at theories about audiences, it's important but difficult. I really do feel that. And I think that when you talk about the authors, particularly historic authors, how do we perceive them or redefine them or reperceive them? Or do we renew our approach to them, change our thinking about them? I think audience is a really important piece of that in terms of the history of theatre, how we face up to that. I think audience lends some important perspectives on that.
Thank you very much. And so I thought, for example, the Theatre Museum collects posters and programs. And also, I was just wondering the history of kind of the program and posters. And of course, I know Tiffany studies ballad, broadside ballad. And I wonder, of course, we might not have time to discuss this topic, but how, for example, the broadside and ballad might reflect on the presence of audience in Shakespeare's time, and how Shakespeare's audience received the performance of Shakespeare's plays, or whether the broadside ballads or ballads show any kind of glimpse of the performance of Shakespeare. I just thought it might be interesting to discuss this topic in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to in the future. I mean, it's as with all information, it's it's tricky. There's something there. I've just written a book on this, so I have a lot to say on the subject.
Yes, yes.
But maybe we should save some of this for the next time.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I I've enjoyed this conversation so much, and I've learned such a
Yes.
lot. And I love to see the pictures as well. Thank you so much, Professor Kodama. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
こちらこそ本当にありがとうございま
Oh,
す。
thank you very much.
So, so shall we have the last words, or is it okay to end up this conversation, or do you have anything? Do you have anything to add, or to summarize, or is it okay to end up?
I mean, you know, I think we could talk forever. So,
Okay.
but I think, you know, in summary, I would simply like to say, I've learned a lot. It has been very exciting to see such close parallels at similar historical moments. And then at the end, it was intriguing for me to learn about types of people I didn't know about, because given the parallels, this now tells me something to look for in case I can find such a kind of person. And I think that's one of the useful things. I've realized there are so many parallels that maybe there are things that you have that we don't have, and vice versa, or maybe your discoveries can help tell me things to look for in case they are also the case here, and perhaps vice versa. So I just want to thank you so much for giving me this
ありが
time
とうござい
and
ました。
sharing your expertise.
本当にありがとうございました。また
Thank
ぜひ
you very much. I truly hope that we will have another opportunity and we can set this up again. But when you talk about that passion of the fans, I think it's not just for theatre, whether it's sports, you know, spectatorship in general. For example, you have a lot of football fans. There must be some theatre passionate fans as well if you get that excited about football. So I think that that's something that, including class issues that you mentioned, perhaps that also has a part to play. But theatre was exceptionally popular at certain times in history, and I'm sure you had similar demographics at that time in Britain. So looking at the time of Shakespeare, and also for those times and eras where it's really hard to have materials left over that we can look at, we touched upon this last time. I think we had an awful lot of similarity. So I did expect that we would have lots of parallels, but even now, in the more later times, as we look back over history, we're seeing very similar parallels coming through. It's a really big discovery for me personally. I feel that from a variety of different aspects, there are so many parallels. I think it's just been a real revelation for me today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So, shall we wrap up the dialogue?